On a freezing winter evening, a Marine fights to stay alive after his truck flips in a deadly snowstorm. He believes no one will find him until a tiny homeless girl steps out of the blizzard and does the unthinkable. What happens next is a moment so powerful, so unexpected, it will stay with you long after this story ends. Stay with me. Because this isn't just a rescue, it's a miracle born in the cold. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching. Leave your city in the comments. And if you believe God sends miracles through ordinary people, subscribe and watch until the end. This story will stay with you long after the snow melts. A dim winter dusk descended early, wind rising as heavy snow drove across the lonely road. Sergeant Morgan Hale, 36 years old, guided his government-issued SUV carefully along the narrow forest highway that wound between the pines. Morgan had the solid, disciplined build of a career Marine, broad shoulders, a straight back, and the unmistakable stillness of a man trained to endure storms both outside and inside. His face, angular and deeply lined despite his age, carried 3 permanent marks: a faint scar running along the right cheekbone from a deployment he refused to talk about, a roughness in his jaw where his beard never fully grew evenly, and eyes that always looked quietly alert, a storm gray that missed nothing. He had remained on active duty after 12 grueling years because order and service were the only things that made sense to him. But beneath the uniform's discipline lay another truth. He carried a fatigue that never fully faded, a heaviness learned from watching too many people fall in battle or fall apart afterward. Coming home each night to his isolated cabin in the hills of Snowfield was his only escape from the noise of command. Beside him sat Apollo, his 5-year-old German Shepherd K9 partner. Apollo's coat shone deep amber even in the dimming light, thick winter fur rippling beneath a specialized harness. The dog was massive, intelligent, and fiercely loyal, trained for search and rescue but with a gentle nature when off duty. Apollo always seemed to sense the mood of whoever sat near him, and lately he had sensed the quiet exhaustion in Morgan's bones. The dog rested his head on Morgan's shoulder occasionally, letting out low, comforting rumbles, as if urging him to stay awake just a little longer on the long ride home. But the roads had turned dangerous faster than expected. The snow thickened, swirling sideways in sharp winds that rattled the SUV. Ice glistened like glass beneath the tires. Morgan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, leaning forward to peer through the streaked windshield. "Easy, boy," he muttered to Apollo, who had lifted his ears in concern. "We're almost home." Yet the forest ahead darkened faster than dusk should allow, shadows mixing with snowfall until visibility shrank to mere meters. Morgan felt his heartbeat quicken, not fear, but calculation. Distance to home, weather speed, potential hazards. Training took over. Then, as he rounded the tight curve near the ravine, the back tires hit a sheet of invisible black ice. Everything happened at once. The SUV slid sideways. Apollo barked sharply as the world lurched. Morgan fought the wheel, trying to countersteer, but the vehicle spun, snow exploding across the windows. The SUV skidded off the shoulder, dipped sharply, and with a violent crunch, slammed onto its side at the bottom of the shallow ditch below. Silence, except for the engine sputtering and Apollo whining in pain. Morgan tried to move, but a bolt of agony tore through his left shoulder, jammed between the seat and crushed doorframe. His forehead throbbed from striking the side window. A thin stream of blood trickled past his eyebrow. The cold air pouring through a crack in the windshield cut into him like a blade. "Apollo," he groaned. The dog had been thrown sideways, tangled in the seatbelt and harness straps. He tried to stand but couldn't, letting out frustrated, weakening barks. Morgan tried to reach him, but the pressure on his shoulder held him trapped. He sucked in a sharp breath, fighting the dizziness that threatened to pull him under. No other cars had passed for 20 minutes. In weather like this, it could be hours. His vision blurred. He blinked hard, trying to stay awake, but the cold seeped deeper. Apollo's barks echoed more distantly. Then utter silence. Morgan drifted into near unconsciousness, unaware that fate was already sending someone toward the wreckage. Far down the roadside, a small figure trudged through the storm. Harper, 7 years old, wandered alone through the swirling snow with her thin arms wrapped tightly around her chest. Her clothes, a ripped gray sweater far too thin for winter, faded leggings smeared with dirt, and shoes with holes at the toes, offered almost no protection. Her hair, chestnut brown and uncombed, hung in tangled strands over her red, wind-chapped face. She walked with a stiffness born from cold and fear and exhaustion. Harper had been homeless for days. She had no coat, no gloves, no destination. Her last night had been spent behind a dumpster where cardboard barely shielded her from the wind. Tonight, she had hoped to find a shed or porch to hide under before the worst of the storm hit. Her breathing came out in small visible puffs, trembling with each step. Every part of her body hurt, but then she heard it, just barely, a faint metallic groan carried by wind. She stopped, held her breath, then something clearer, a faint dog bark, muffled but desperate. Harper's heart kicked hard in her chest. Someone needed help. Fear warred with instinct inside her. She was too cold, too tired, too small. But she also remembered the countless times she herself had cried for help and no one came. The memory of that loneliness burned stronger than the freezing wind. She followed the sound. Snow clung to her eyelashes as she stumbled toward the ravine. Then she saw it, a dark shape overturned in the ditch, a vehicle, broken glass, an animal struggling inside. She rushed closer, panting, her breaths sharp and uneven. When she reached the window, her eyes widened. She saw the unconscious face of Morgan slumped forward, blood on his temple, his broad frame pinned awkwardly. Harper had never seen a Marine in uniform up close before, but something in his stillness terrified her. She pressed her small hands to the glass. "Sir? Sir, please wake up." No response. Then Apollo spotted her. His amber, eyes urgent. He barked sharply, the sound echoing through the wreck. Harper flinched but didn't back away. The dog wasn't angry, he was pleading. "I'll help," she whispered, voice barely audible. Her fingers, numb and shaking, scraped snow away from the door. The handle wouldn't budge. It was jammed. Harper circled, pushing through knee-high snow until she reached a section of the shattered rear window. She forced her small body through the narrow gap, cutting her wrist on the glass but ignoring the sting. Inside smelled like gasoline, cold metal, and fear. Apollo licked her hand anxiously. Harper reached for the tangled seatbelt. The latch was stuck, and her fingers felt stiff, but she tugged again and again until, click, it released. Apollo scrambled free, shaking snow from his fur. Immediately he turned to Morgan, barking at Harper as if urging her to help him too. "I'm trying," she whispered. She couldn't lift Morgan, but she could reach his shoulder. She pressed both hands against him and pushed with all her strength. Morgan moaned softly, eyes fluttering. Harper nearly cried in relief. "Sir, please wake up. You have to get out." The cold inside the broken vehicle bit through his uniform, shocking Morgan back to consciousness. His vision swam. Shapes, snow, a child's face only inches away. A child? What are you doing here?" he rasped. "You were stuck," Harper said, voice shaking. I heard you." Apollo barked sharply again. Morgan gathered what strength he had left. With Harper pushing on his arm and Apollo pulling at his sleeve, Morgan shifted enough to free his trapped shoulder. Pain flared white-hot, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to crawl toward the exit. When he finally collapsed into the snow outside, gasping, the world spun violently. He saw Harper sway on her feet, her lips blue, her thin sweater frost-covered. Then she collapsed. "Harper? Harper," he shouted, though he didn't know her name yet. Apollo whined anxiously, circling her. Morgan forced himself upright despite the throbbing in his shoulder. His breath tore through his chest as he scooped the tiny girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, far too light for a 7-year-old. Her skin was freezing. "You saved me," he whispered, voice thick with disbelief and something deeper. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his body around her small frame to protect her from the wind. Apollo pressed against Morgan's legs, offering warmth and urgency. The storm raged on. The path back to the cabin blurred, but Morgan staggered forward through the darkness, carrying the unconscious child whose courage had pulled him back from death. He didn't yet know her name. He didn't know where she came from. He didn't know the nightmare she had escaped, but he knew one thing. This little girl had just changed the direction of his entire life. And as the cabin lights finally flickered through the trees, another shadow moved quietly in the distance, watching them. Snow pressed heavily against the cabin windows as the storm deepened. But inside the single-room wooden shelter, a faint orange glow flickered from the fireplace that Sergeant Morgan Hale managed to start despite the throbbing pain in his shoulder. He lowered himself carefully onto one knee beside the child resting on his old couch. Apollo, his amber-furred German Shepherd canine partner, sat vigilantly near her feet, head lowered, breath slow, ears flickering at each disturbing gust of wind. Harper lay curled on her side beneath a thick wool blanket Morgan had taken from his storage chest. Up close, she looked even smaller, fragile in a way that made Morgan feel a pressure in his chest that he had not felt since tending to injured civilians overseas. Her cheeks were flushed from cold exposure, and her lips, though warming, still had a faint purplish tint. Her small hands clutched the blanket tightly, as if afraid someone might pull it away. Morgan recognized that subconscious grip. It was one he had seen in children in war zones who slept without ever fully believing they were safe. He rose, walked to the kitchen counter, filled a kettle with water, and set it above the fire. He moved slowly. His shoulder screamed each time he lifted his arm. Yet despite his injury, his mind remained alert and active, locked onto the strange and undeniable truth. A tiny homeless girl had saved his life. As he prepared a bowl of warm broth, Morgan kept glancing back at her. He studied the details he had not noticed in the chaos outside. Harper had long eyelashes clumped slightly from melted snow, a dusting of freckles across her small nose, and hair that had once been trimmed neatly but had grown uneven, some strands too long and others broken or jagged. Not the look of a child raised carelessly, he realized, but one abandoned abruptly. When he returned to her, Harper stirred, eyelids fluttering. Morgan crouched beside her and spoke gently. "Hey, you're safe. You're warm. Can you sit up?" Harper blinked at him, confusion passing over her face before she shakily pushed herself upward. Apollo nuzzled her knee. Her fingers curled into his fur immediately, a sign of trust that made Morgan's throat tighten. He placed the bowl into her trembling hands. "Slow sips. It's hot." Harper obeyed instantly. She drank in small, cautious spoonfuls, her gaze darting to Morgan's face as though checking if she was allowed to eat. When one drop spilled on her sleeve, she froze like she expected punishment. Morgan noticed. Every Marine instinct in him sharpened. "No rush," he said softly. "You're safe, really." Harper nodded, though the fear in her posture didn't disappear. She continued eating slowly, methodically, almost ritualistically. Morgan watched her with growing unease. He remembered children who flinched at sudden noises, who ate too carefully, who apologized for existing. Many had come from places where kindness was rare and warmth rarer. After finishing the broth, Harper held the empty bowl in her lap, staring at it before looking up. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Thank you, sir." Morgan sat down on the wooden crate across from her. "What's your name?" "Harper." "Harper," he repeated gently. "I'm Morgan, and that's Apollo." Apollo wagged his tail once, then returned to his silent guard. Morgan observed her again, the way she sat stiffly upright, feet tucked tight under the blanket, shoulders tense. He softened his tone. "Harper, why were you out there alone in the snow?" Harper's eyes dropped to the bowl. Her shoulders curled inward. I was just walking." "In a blizzard?" he asked, careful to avoid sounding harsh. "Where were you heading?" Silence. Harper drew the blanket closer, her breathing quickened. She shook her head once, tiny. Morgan inhaled slowly. "Is someone looking for you?" She flinched. That was an answer by itself. He noticed faint bruises along her wrist, older ones fading green, newer ones purple. He noticed the sleeves of her sweater, ripped, stretched, stained, not torn from play, but from pulling or grabbing hands. He noticed how she startled when a strong gust rattled the cabin door. A child didn't learn these behaviors unless someone taught them fear. He exhaled carefully, restraining the anger rising beneath his ribs. Anger not at her, but for her. Harper spoke again, this time so quietly he had to lean forward to hear. "I don't have a home." Morgan held still. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous. He kept his voice level. "You don't have anyone? No parents? Relatives?" She shook her head, but Morgan noticed something odd. A hesitation. The kind that wasn't a lie, but wasn't the full truth either. She didn't want to talk, or she didn't dare. Harper's voice trembled. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be trouble." Morgan felt something inside him break. "You are not trouble." His tone came out firmer than he intended, but Harper looked up, surprised. "You saved my life," he added, quieter. "You and Apollo. I owe you more than dinner and a warm blanket." Again she shook her head violently, as if the idea of being owed anything frightened her. She pulled her knees to her chest. Morgan understood that gesture intimately. Children who had been hit, yelled at, or grabbed often folded themselves inward like that, becoming small, invisible, hoping danger would pass. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, frustrated at the world that had placed this child alone in the dark. "Harper, look at me." She did. "No one is going to hurt you here. I promise." A tear slid down her cheek, surprising her as much as him. Morgan stood, pushing past the ache in his shoulder to fetch a first aid kit. Harper watched him with wide eyes, as though each movement might be something unexpected. He sat beside her again. "May I?" She nodded timidly. He cleaned the shallow cut on her wrist carefully, the wound she got from sliding through the broken glass. As he worked, he noticed newer scratches, tiny welts on her forearm, and what looked like the faint outline of fingers bruised into her upper arm. Each mark made his jaw tighten further. When he was done, he bandaged the cut gently. Harper pulled her hand back like she wasn't used to anyone treating her kindly. Morgan asked, "How long have you been alone?" "A while," she whispered. "Days? Weeks?" She swallowed. I don't know." He could see her shutting down again, breathing shallow. He didn't push further. Instead, he placed another blanket on her lap and said, "You can sleep here tonight. I'll stay awake and keep the fire going." Harper looked around the cabin as though seeing it properly for the first time. It wasn't much. One room, wood panel walls, a table, a stove, a small bed Morgan never made, and photographs from deployments pinned to the mantel. But to her, it must have looked like a castle. "You don't have to stay awake," she whispered. Morgan smiled faintly. "I've stayed awake in worse places." But the truth was, he wasn't ready to close his eyes. His mind ran through possibilities: a lost child, an escape, an abduction, an abusive guardian. She wasn't on any missing child alert. He would know. That meant no one had reported her. That meant someone wanted her invisible. The kettle whistled, sharp through the quiet. Harper jumped violently, covering her head. Apollo immediately pressed against her side, whining softly. Morgan moved quickly to turn off the kettle. "That sound scared you?" he asked. Harper nodded without speaking. Morgan's thoughts darkened. He recognized trauma-conditioned flinching. He had seen Marines react that way to explosive echoes during recovery. For a child to have those reflexes, something was terribly wrong. He considered making a call to the sheriff's office, but the storm had knocked down service lines. Even if it hadn't, something told him to wait. Harper needed calm, not interrogation. Instead, he sat across from her again. "Why did you help me?" he asked cautiously. Harper's small fingers twisted into Apollo's fur. Her answer came soft and hesitant. Because nobody helped me when I asked." Morgan swallowed. That sentence cut deeper than any wound he'd taken in combat. Apollo shifted, resting his large head on Harper's lap. Harper stroked him with trembling hands. The cabin felt warmer now, but a strange heaviness hung between them, like Harper had shared a secret without meaning to. Morgan finally rose. "You should rest. Tomorrow we'll figure things out together." Harper lay down slowly, still watching him as if waiting for him to disappear. Only when Apollo curled beside her did she close her eyes. Morgan sat near the fire, holding a mug of cooling tea in his good hand. His shoulder pulsed with pain, but the ache inside his chest was worse. He kept replaying the sight of her walking alone through the storm, the moment she froze at the kettle's whistle, the bruises shaped like fingers. No child survived that kind of fear by accident. The storm beat against the windows as the night deepened. Morgan's eyes drifted toward the door. A faint crunch in the snow outside made him stiffen. Apollo lifted his head sharply, ears rising, body tense. Footsteps. Very slow, very deliberate. Morgan stood in silence, every instinct sharpening. Someone was out there in the darkness, and whoever it was had found them. Morning crept in slowly, filtered through the heavy gray of a winter sky ended thick with lingering storm clouds. The cabin remained cold despite the dying embers in the fireplace, and Sergeant Morgan Hale rose early, moving gingerly as his injured shoulder pulled painfully when he stretched. Apollo, the 5-year-old amber-furred German shepherd, trotted beside him, tail low, sensing tension that had not faded overnight. Harper still slept on the couch, her small body curled beneath 2 blankets, her breathing soft and shallow. The fear on her face had not fully disappeared even in sleep. Morgan dressed quietly, choosing civilian clothes, a dark jacket, worn boots, and a gray thermal shirt, because the day ahead required discretion, not a uniform. When Harper finally woke, she blinked at him as though still unsure if last night's safety was real. Morgan offered her a warm cup of instant oatmeal and bread. She thanked him in a whisper, eating slowly as always, careful and quiet. "We're going into town," Morgan said gently. "A doctor will make sure you're all right. No hospitals, just a small clinic. Is that okay?" Harper hesitated but nodded, her fingers twisting the hem of her blanket. She didn't ask questions. She never did. Apollo stayed close as they stepped outside into fresh snow, the world silent except for the wind rustling through pine branches. The walk to Morgan's truck was slow. His shoulder protested, and Harper's small legs sank into the snow with each step. Morgan boosted her into the vehicle, making sure she was buckled securely. Apollo climbed in after her, settling protectively against her side. As they drove toward town, Harper stared out the window at the white hills, eyes distant, as though watching memories only she could see. Morgan resisted the urge to question her too soon. Trust needed time. Snowfield Town Clinic sat on the corner of Maple Street, a modest 1-story building with green trim and a faded sign. Inside, it smelled faintly of antiseptic and pine floor cleaner. A receptionist looked up, a middle-aged woman named Linda Carver, with soft brown skin, warm hazel eyes, and curly black hair streaked with gold. She wore a loose cardigan and radiated the calm patience of someone who had worked years in small-town healthcare. "Morning, Sergeant Hale," she greeted, recognizing him from previous minor injuries. "Rough night?" Morgan forced a smile. "You could say that. The kid needs a checkup, no paperwork. Just make sure she's okay." Linda's brows furrowed. Paperwork was standard, but she sensed this was not the moment to push. "Doctor is free. Room 2. Linda's compassionate nature made her avoid unnecessary questions. She had seen enough quiet tragedies in town to understand when someone was trying to protect a child. Harper walked hesitantly beside Morgan, gripping Apollo's harness for reassurance. Inside room 2, Dr. Samuel Reyes entered, a man in his early 50s, tall and lean with salt and pepper hair and rectangular glasses. His features were sharp, almost hawkish, but softened by a patient, thoughtful expression. Years working in rural areas had made him pragmatic and emotionally steady. "Let's take a look," he said calmly. He examined Harper methodically, checking her temperature, listening to her lungs, inspecting her hands and feet for frostbite. He frowned when he saw the scattering of older bruises on her arms, some in the shape of fingers. His tone remained gentle, but there was steel underneath. "Has someone hurt you?" Harper froze, eyes wide, but Morgan stepped forward. "It's okay," he whispered. "He's not going to take you away." Harper trembled, then whispered, "I don't know." Morgan could hear the lie, or the fear behind the truth, but he didn't interrupt. Dr. Reyes continued quietly, "She's malnourished, mild frostbite on her toes, dehydration, and several older contusions. Nothing requiring hospitalization, but she needs rest, warmth, and stable care." He paused deliberately, eyes meeting Morgan's. "Do you know who her guardian is?" Morgan shook his head. Harper's fingers tightened around Apollo's fur. Dr. Reyes exhaled. "I'll file a basic well-being note. No full report until you tell me to. But this child, someone failed her." Morgan felt his jaw tighten. "Not anymore." Harper looked at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. After leaving the clinic, Morgan guided Harper and Apollo down Main Street. Shops were opening, scraping snow off their entryways. People nodded at Morgan, respectful of the Marine with a reputation for quiet strength and integrity. But each time someone approached too quickly, Harper shrank behind Morgan's leg. He noticed everything. They stopped at Dawson's General Store, a family-run shop with an old wooden sign and a bell that jingled when the door opened. Inside, canned goods, tools, boots, and winter clothing filled the aisles. Behind the counter stood Elliot Dawson, a wiry man in his late 40s with pale hair, a bushy mustache, and a frame hardened by years of hauling crates. His blue eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "Morning, Sergeant," Elliot said. "Storm gave you trouble?" Morgan nodded. "Could say that." Elliot looked down at Harper, who clutched Apollo's collar, half hiding behind the dog. "Haven't seen her before." "She helped me last night," Morgan said simply. Elliot's eyes widened. "In that storm?" "Yeah." Elliot glanced at the bruises on her wrist, then back at Morgan. Morgan didn't need to explain further. Elliot lowered his voice. "There was a man here last week," he said. "Tall, scruffy, mean-looking, had a gray coat and heavy boots, smelled like he hadn't bathed in months. He grabbed a little girl by the arm hard enough to make her cry. She looked a lot like her." His eyes flicked to Harper. Harper went rigid. Her skin lost what little color it had. Morgan's pulse kicked. "Did you get a name?" "No, but he paid with crumpled bills and left north toward the old freight yard." Morgan stored that information instantly. Harper inhaled sharply through her nose, her tiny hands shaking. He knelt beside her. "Harper, was that man someone you know?" She didn't speak, didn't shake or nod. She simply stared downward, tears balancing at the edge of her lashes. She whispered, "He found me once?" Morgan understood the rest without words. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Apollo pushed against her gently, grounding her. After buying warm clothes and boots for Harper, they returned to the truck. Morgan strapped her in. His movements careful. He sat in the driver's seat but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he pulled out his tablet, military issued, with limited access to local databases. Snowfield's missing child reports were few, so scanning them didn't take long. No record matched Harper, no reports filed, no guardians on file. She was a ghost in the system, invisible. "No one reported you missing," Morgan murmured. Harper stared at her hands. "Nobody would." Morgan felt heat burn in his chest, not anger at her, but at the world that had allowed this. He pulled up child welfare databases, cross-referenced local shelters, scanned juvenile records. Nothing. He finally closed the device. "Harper, you didn't just run away. You escaped." Her eyes widened, breath catching. He didn't press further. Instead, he said softly, "You're not going back." Harper swallowed. For the first time, the faintest spark of hope flickered across her face. On the drive back toward the cabin, the sky darkened again as another wave of snow approached. Harper leaned against Apollo, exhaustion pulling at her features. Morgan kept glancing into the rearview mirror at her small form wrapped in her new coat. A question lingered in his mind, one he didn't voice yet. If that man came looking for her, how far would he go? As they reached the forest road, Harper suddenly whispered, "Morgan?" "Yeah? Do I really get to stay?" Morgan met her gaze in the mirror. "As long as you need to. I'm not letting anything happen to you." Harper nodded slowly, resting her head against Apollo's side. For the first time, she seemed to breathe easier. But even as Morgan said the words, he sensed the truth settling heavily in his gut. This wasn't over. A child with no records didn't just wander into a blizzard by chance. Someone dangerous was involved, and that someone might already be searching again. The wind howled outside as they neared the cabin, snow swirling across the path like warning whispers from the forest. Morgan tightened his grip on the wheel. He had found the first pieces of Harper's past, and every part of it pointed toward one chilling fact. She had run because someone meant to claim her, and he intended to find out who. Night settled hard over the forest, bringing with it a cold so sharp it felt carved out of steel. The sky churned above Snowfield in a restless mix of dark clouds and drifting snowflakes, and every tree seemed to groan beneath the weight of the winter air. Inside the cabin, however, a fragile bubble of warmth held steady. Fire crackling, blankets layered thickly, Harper seated at the small wooden table tracing circles on the steam-covered cup of cocoa Morgan had made for her. Apollo lay near her chair, the 5-year-old German shepherd's amber fur glowing faintly in the firelight as he watched every sound outside with the wary discipline of a trained working dog. Morgan had left an hour earlier to buy more supplies, food for Harper, medical salve for her healing frostbite, and new blankets because the old ones in the cabin smelled too much of campfires and age. Before going, he had knelt in front of Harper, making sure she could look him in the eye. "I won't be long," he'd said. "Apollo stays with you. He'll protect you." Harper nodded, though she bit her lip with a tension that hadn't left her since he found her. She had grown more comfortable speaking to Morgan, trusting him in tiny moments, but being without him, even for minutes, made her curl in on herself all over again. Now she sat in the flickering light, fingers trembling as she turned her cup. Apollo's large body remained planted between her and the front door. The dog's instincts rarely failed, and tonight they were sharpened to a blade. A branch snapped outside, not a heavy crack from wind, something lighter, deliberate. Harper froze. Apollo rose instantly, standing rigid, tail lowered but straight, hackles lifting in a slow, warning wave. Harper whispered his name, barely audible. He didn't move except to take one step closer to the door. She recognized that posture. She'd seen it once before, the night she escaped. Harper slid off her chair and back toward the wall, pressing herself into the shadows. Her hands shook violently. She tried to focus on the warmth of the cabin, Morgan's promise, Apollo's presence. But the memories clawed through her mind like broken glass. The man's voice, his grip on her arm, the dark nights when she'd learned the truth about being powerless. The doorknob shifted, not loudly, but with the slow, testing pressure of someone who believed he deserved entry. Harper's breath caught. She didn't scream. Fear had taught her silence, but tears welled instantly, blurring the wooden planks of the floor. Apollo growled, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through the room. The door pushed inward an inch, then another. A figure squeezed through the crack. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but hunched slightly as though years of anger had bent him inward. His coat, a heavy gray work jacket, was stained with dirt and old oil. His face was rough, marked by unshaven stubble, a crooked nose that looked like it had been mi-bung, broken long ago, and skin weathered by cold and hard living. His eyes, sharp and small beneath his furrowed brow, held a feral desperation, the kind belonging to someone who survived through intimidation and had never learned another method. This was Reed Mallory, the man Harper once followed because she had no choice. Reed, around 40, had once been a day laborer in a freight yard, known for his temper that snapped like brittle metal. A childhood of constant neglect and adult years of drifting had forged him into someone who viewed the world through suspicion and entitlement. He never spoke softly, never asked when he could demand. When he saw Harper, a twisted smile curled across his face. "There you are," he rasped, voice scratchy, shaped by cheap cigarettes and anger. "Thought you could run off with my money, did you?" Harper shook her head violently, unable to form words. She knew better. Reed's money had not been hers to touch, yet he told himself stories to justify cruelty. Apollo barked, sharp and loud, lunging forward. Reed flinched but stepped further inside, closing the door behind him. "Shut up, mutt!" he snapped and swung his arm. The hit landed hard against Apollo's side. The dog yelped, stumbling back but not falling. Harper gasped, hands clamping over her mouth. Apollo recovered instantly, planting his feet, growling deeper, eyes locked on Reed. Reed pointed a finger at Harper. "You're coming with me, now!" His voice cracked like a whip. Harper pressed herself harder into the corner, tears streaking her cheeks. She shook her head again, whispering, "No, no, please." Reed stepped forward, lifting his arm as if to grab her. Apollo leapt. The dog struck Reed's leg, teeth bared but controlled, trained to disable, not maim. Reed cursed, stumbling backward and kicking violently. The kick caught Apollo in the ribs. The dog yelped again but didn't retreat. He circled, snarling, blocking Reed from reaching Harper. "Damn animal!" Reed roared. He lunged at Harper anyway. But in that exact moment, the cabin door burst open, slammed by a forceful gust of wind and someone behind it. Morgan strode inside, snow scattering around him, grocery bags dropping from his arms. His eyes, storm gray, sharp, seasoned from years of combat, took in everything at once. Harper cowering, Apollo wounded but standing guard, Reed's aggressive posture, and the fear thick in the air like smoke. Rage rose in Morgan so swiftly it tightened every muscle in his body. "Step away from her," Morgan said. The low, lethal tone did not raise in volume, because it didn't need to. Reed spun, sneering. "She's my responsibility." Morgan moved closer slowly, deliberately. "No, she isn't, not anymore." Reed eyed him up and down, assessing. Morgan was taller by a fraction, stronger by years of disciplined training, and held a presence Reed had no hope of matching. Reed's bravado wavered, but desperation made him reckless. "She stole from me." "She escaped you," Morgan corrected, jaw tightening. "That is not the same thing." Reed lunged again. Whether for Morgan or Harper, Morgan didn't care. He intercepted instantly. His shoulder screamed in pain, but adrenaline overrode the weakness. He grabbed Reed's jacket, twisted his arm behind his back, and slammed him forward onto the nearest wall with controlled force. Reed let out a strangled yell. Apollo barked triumphantly. "Let go!" Reed barked, struggling. "She's mine." "She's a child," Morgan snapped, "and you will not touch her again." With smooth, practiced motion, Morgan used his body weight to pin Reed. His injured shoulder protested, but he held the man firmly enough that Reed's legs kicked helplessly on the floor. Harper watched, trembling, her hands clasped tightly under her chin. Tears streamed freely now, though her eyes stayed glued to Morgan as if afraid he would disappear. Morgan pulled Reed's hands behind him, securing them with zip ties from his coat pocket. He always carried them, a habit ingrained from field operations. Reed cursed, voice cracking into fear rather than aggression. Morgan reached for the radio on the wall, the cabin's backup emergency device, and called the local sheriff's office. "This is Sergeant Morgan Hale," he said sharply. "I have a detainee attempting to abduct a minor. Immediate response required." Reed snarled, thrashing. "You don't know what she did. She ran off. She stole—" "She survived you," Morgan interrupted coldly. "That's what she did." Minutes later, though it felt longer, the distant wail of a patrol siren cut through the forest. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, they hauled Reed into the back of the cruiser. He shouted threats, insults, slurs, but none of it mattered. Morgan stood at the doorway, Apollo pressed against his leg, watching Reed disappear into the snow. When the car's lights finally vanished, Morgan turned toward Harper. She stood shivering in the center of the room, arms wrapped tightly around her chest. Her voice cracked as she whispered, I thought he would take me again." Morgan stepped forward carefully, kneeling despite the pain in his shoulder. He placed both hands, steady, warm, on her small, trembling shoulders. "No one is taking you," he said, voice low, firm, carrying the weight of an oath. Harper's face crumpled, relief breaking through her fear. She launched herself into his arms, burying her face against his chest. Morgan held her gently, protectively, one arm around her back, the other shielding her head. Apollo pressed in closer, whining softly. Morgan lowered his chin, whispering, "No one is taking you ever again. I promise." Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, the cabin glowed with the faint but undeniable warmth of something new, safety, born from danger. Morning broke quietly over Snowfield, the storm finally spent, leaving the forest washed in white. A pale gold light filtered through the frost-laced windows of the cabin as Sergeant Morgan Hale stood at the counter, pouring hot water into 2 mugs, one for himself, strong and dark, and one with warm milk and honey for Harper. Apollo lay near the fireplace, stretched on his side, amber fur glistening in the warmth, though the faint bruise on his ribs still showed where Reed had kicked him. The dog watched the room with calm, loyal eyes, rising slightly whenever Harper shifted. Harper sat curled on the couch, bundled in the new winter coat Morgan had bought her the previous day. It was bright red, far too big, sleeves rolled past her wrists, but she kept pulling the fabric around herself like a safety shield. She had barely spoken since the incident with Reed. Fear still lingered in her posture, in the way her fingers twined tightly together, in the way she glanced at the door every few minutes as though expecting it to shudder open again. Morgan set the warm milk in front of her. "Drink," he said softly. "It'll help." Harper nodded and obeyed, though her hands trembled around the mug. Apollo lifted his head and pressed his nose gently against her knee. Harper smiled faintly, pushing her fingers into the thick fur between his ears. It was the first smile Morgan had seen since last night. A soft knock sounded at the door. Harper flinched violently and spilled a few drops of milk. Morgan crossed the room quickly, signaling her that everything was fine. He opened the door to reveal Sheriff Daniel Brody, a man in his late 50s with a tall, barrel-chested build and a thick salt-gray beard trimmed neatly along a square jaw. His skin was weathered from years outdoors, and his deep-set blue eyes held the stern patience of someone who had spent decades listening to lies and learning to recognize truth. Sheriff Brody was known in Snowfield as a fair lawman, strict with criminals, patient with the vulnerable. Trauma in his early career, including losing a child in a custody case gone wrong, had made him particularly protective of kids in danger. "Morning, Sergeant," he greeted, stepping inside to escape the cold. Morgan nodded. "Sheriff." Brody glanced toward Harper, who had shrunk behind Apollo but peeked over the dog's back. His expression softened instantly. "This must be her." Morgan closed the door. "Harper. And yes, she's the one Reed tried to take." Brody's jaw flexed with restrained anger. "We questioned him last night. He's been flagged before. Multiple tips about child neglect, abuse allegations, nothing ever proven." "Because the victims couldn't testify," Morgan said darkly. Brody nodded. "Exactly. But this time we have intent, trespassing, attempted abduction, resisting arrest. He's staying locked up." Harper watched the men closely, her eyes wide. Brody crouched slowly, careful not to frighten her, and introduced himself. "Hi there, Harper. I'm Daniel. I'm here to make sure nobody hurts you again." "Nobody." Harper bit her lip, studying his face. Sheriff Brody was big. His shoulders alone seemed to fill the doorway, but his eyes were kind. After a long hesitation, she whispered, He tried to take me." "I know," Brody replied softly, "and he won't get the chance again." He reached into his coat and pulled out a simple folder. "Sergeant, the county's child welfare office wants to place her into temporary protective custody under someone responsible." Morgan stiffened. "Meaning?" Brody stood and handed him the folder. "Meaning you." Harper froze. Morgan blinked. "I'm not a registered foster guardian." "Doesn't matter," Brody said. "Given the circumstances, your status, and the fact that the child trusts you, Child Protective Services is granting an emergency placement, short-term, under supervision." Harper looked between them, panic flickering behind her eyes. Do I have to leave?" she whispered. Morgan knelt beside her, placing one steady hand on her shoulder. "Only if you want to." "Harper, they're asking if you want to stay with me while everything gets sorted." Harper's breath hitched. She looked at Apollo first, as if the dog's presence was her compass, and then at Morgan. I want to stay," she said, voice cracking. Brody smiled warmly. "Then that settles it." He handed Morgan the official document, stamped and dated. "You are now her temporary guardian. We'll check in weekly. CPS will ask questions, but she stays here under your care." Morgan nodded once. "Thank you." Brody touched the brim of his hat out of habit. "She's lucky to have landed where she did." Morgan looked at Harper, thin, trembling, clutching her oversized red coat, and felt the weight of that statement. "I'm the lucky one," he murmured. When the sheriff left, Morgan spent the rest of the morning preparing a room Harper could call her own. The cabin wasn't large, 2 small bedrooms in the open living area, but one room had been used mostly for storage. Now it would change purpose. Morgan carried boxes outside, dusted shelves, opened the curtains for more light, and laid out a simple blue quilt on the bed. He found an old lamp with a warm yellow glow and placed it on the table. Harper stood in the doorway quietly, eyes wide, as though afraid to enter a space that belonged to her. "It's yours," Morgan told her. "All of it." Harper stepped inside slowly. Her fingers ran along the quilt, the shelves, the window frame. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she whispered, "Nobody ever made a room for me." The words hit Morgan harder than any blow he'd taken in the field. "Well," he said softly, "that changes now." Apollo trotted in, immediately hopping onto the bed and curling against the pillows. Harper giggled, a soft, surprised sound, when the dog nosed her hand. "He wants to sleep here," she whispered. Morgan grinned. "Looks like you've got a bodyguard." Her smile warmed further. a big one. That afternoon, Morgan made soup, real soup, not the powdered meals he usually lived on. He sliced vegetables, simmered broth, added noodles and chicken. The cabin filled with the scent of something comforting and homemade. Harper sat at the table, swinging her feet gently, watching him cook with awe as though witnessing a magic trick. During dinner, she ate slowly but not fearfully. She looked up several times to check that Morgan was still there. The room felt warmer than ever. After the dishes were washed and Harper took the first warm bath she'd had in weeks, she settled into her new bed. The lamp cast golden light across her face. Apollo curled beside her, claiming half the blanket. Harper stroked his fur until her eyes drooped. Morgan leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene with a quiet sense of something shifting inside him. Not duty, not obligation, something deeper. "Morgan?" Harper mumbled sleepily. "Yeah? You won't leave, right?" Morgan stepped closer, tucking the quilt around her shoulders. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Harper sighed softly and let sleep claim her. Apollo snored gently at her side. Morgan stood there for a long time, the same thought repeating in his mind. She saved my life once, but what she really needed was someone to save hers. He closed the door halfway, letting the warm light spill into the hall. The cabin felt different now, less empty, more alive. Morgan walked to the living room and sat heavily in his chair, letting the quiet seep in. His life had changed course without warning, not through battlefield orders, but through the courage of a child standing alone in a blizzard. A Marine paid his debts. But this wasn't repayment, this was purpose. Harper had given him something he hadn't realized he'd been missing, a reason to fight for more than survival. And as he listened to the soft breaths of the child sleeping safely for the first time in a long while, he understood something with absolute clarity. He hadn't just rescued her from danger. He had rescued her from a life she never deserved, and in return, she had rescued him from a loneliness he thought would last forever. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or lightning. Sometimes they come quietly, in the shape of a frightened little girl in the snow, or a weary Marine searching for a reason to believe again. In moments like these, we're reminded that God still works through ordinary people, guiding them toward each other at the exact second they need saving. Harper and Morgan didn't just cross paths by chance. Something greater placed them in each other's lives, turning fear into hope and loneliness into family. And maybe that's the message for all of us. Even in the coldest seasons of life, God can send warmth in ways we never expect. A stranger, a helping hand, a second chance, a new beginning. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that miracles still happen. Leave a comment below. Tell us your thoughts, your prayers, or your own story of hope. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so more people can hear stories that remind us of faith, compassion, and the quiet ways God watches over us. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps, today and always.